Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku became the light in the dark part 1. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see part 2, comment down below. And let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content and leave a like. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel. And also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story Streggae from fanfiction. So let's start the video. Dark Light, the origin of Izuku Midoriya. He'd always known that not everyone was born equal. He'd known it since he was 4. That's mean Kaken. Izuku Midoriya, known as the only boy in his class who hadn't manifested his quirk, stood before his childhood friend Katsuki Kaken Bakugo and his 2 cronies. Behind him, lying on the ground, was their recent bully victim. "Look, you made him cry. I won't let you hurt him anymore." He knew it was stupid, hopeless even. At least the boy behind him had a means to protect himself, even though it proved fruitless. But him. Katsuki laughed and punched his palm, creating a miniature explosion. "You playing at Hero Deku? You don't even have a quirk." He had nothing, and everyone made sure to remind him of it every day. His so-called friends, whom he admired because they had what he hadn't. They had no qualms with beating him down despite his handicap. Today was no different, he thought, bracing himself for the inevitable. Extended fingers grabbed his head, and his arms were grabbed. Katsuki reared his fist back. "You should really learn your place, Deku." In another time, Katsuki's fist would have hit, causing a bruise to form on Izuku's cheek. When asked about it by his mother, he would have passed it off as an accident happening while he was playing with his friends. His mother would be none the wiser as to the further physical and psychological abuse her son would face in the oncoming years. However, at this time, at this place, something else happened. The moment Katsuki's fist impacted his cheek, there was a blinding light that enveloped all 5 of them and the street itself. All 3 of the bullies were roughly tossed aside. Extended fingers slammed into a wall. Dragon wings flew so far into the air, he was lost in the skyline, and Katsuki ended up overturning some trash cans. The light subsided, leaving a bewildered Izuku and bullied victim. Blinking a little, Izuku staring at the receding light on his palms until he remembered the boy and turned around. "Are you okay?" The boy, who was speechless, could only nod, his tears temporarily gone. 𝗬. 2 heads turned to see Katsuki pull himself up with a groan. "What the?" He stared at the boys, then his fallen followers, and put 2 and 2 together. "Deku," said boy, turned. "Run, I'll hold him, oh oof." Before he could finish, Katsuki tackled him to the ground. Izuku desperately tried to summon the power from before. Unfortunately, nothing happened. **smack**. For the next few months, Izuku tried time and again to summon his unknown quirk with no progress. He didn't even know how he did it in the first place. But what he did know was that it happened when Katsuki was bullying him, so it might appear in times of stress. His cronies had already spread the word about the power of Izuku's mysterious quirk, but so far no one has seen it. Katsuki took this as a personal insult, as he thought Deku thought they weren't good enough for him to show them his quirk, and so went on a one-man crusade to get him to use it again. The bullying began to become more frequent and outright dangerous. For a time, Katsuki was hell-bent. But after several months of nothing, everything went back to normal, and Izuku's quirkless status was re-established with the passing of the singular event. No one cared anymore that technically Izuku had a quirk. As far as they were concerned, out of sight, out of mind. Unknown to everyone else, Izuku never stopped trying to manifest it. He may not have been able to cause a light wave as he did the first time, but he managed to take stock of things happening to his body, things only he could have noticed. Things such as, through his numerous beatings, how his wounds practically healed overnight. How his stamina was a lot greater than before. And most importantly, it was how he felt when he was outside. More specifically, when he was exposed to the sun. It wasn't anything special at first, but as Izuku began obsessing with his mysterious quirk, both to show everyone he had won, and to study it himself, he took note of almost anything out of the norm. Needless to say, he picked up on it rather quickly. After the incident, he started waking up literally at the crack of dawn, when that ray of light would pass through the blinds to shine on his face. He never flinched away from the contact with the sun's rays. In fact, he embraced it. He always felt gloomy on a cloudy day, and he would smile more, particularly in the summer. At one point, he even did an experiment using a bruise he got from Katsuki the day prior. He exposed it to the sun, and after a few minutes he watched as it cleared, it leaving radiant skin. After compiling his evidence, he came to the assurance that he did indeed have a quirk, but the thing that irked him was not knowing what that quirk was. All he knew was that it had something to do with the sun and light. How was he supposed to be a hero when he didn't even know what his quirk was? So after pleading with his mother, she opted to take a little time off and take him to specialist. Izuku stared down at the grinning action figure of his idol All Might. His mother sat beside him patiently waiting for the doctor to arrive with the results. Quirk tests were conducted for nearly every new and/or mysterious quirk manifested in a child. It did well not only for the parents to know in case they need to take any precautions, but the government likes to categorize all types of quirks. He finally looked up when the doctor came in with a few documents. His mother also looked to him expectantly. As for the doctor, he looked equal parts excited and thoughtful. "Well, little Izuku's quirk is certainly a rare one," he began. "What is it?" Izuku shouted. The suspense was killing him. His mother was more genial, though she too would like to know. Is there a reason why he can't manifest it at will? I know it should be difficult at his age, but all the other students can at least do something. But that is the thing," he said matter-of-factly. "His quirk has been active all along, even now. At this very moment his quirk active. That caused the mother and son to blink. What exactly is his quirk?" At this the doctor smiled. "Solar radiation absorption." Izuku tilted his head. "Huh? What's that?" "Basically, Izuku, you are a solar battery. Your body absorbs solar energy, that is, energy from the sun, and uses that energy as a buffer for your bodily functions. You said that when it manifested, there was an explosion of light, correct?" Izuku nodded. "Yeah, there was like a really bright light and Kekken was flying." The doctor nodded. "I see. Well, that should explain why you haven't been able to manifest it like you did before. And for just how long has his quirk has manifested?" Inko looked at the man in confusion. "What do you mean?" "I mean, that explosion of light is the result of months, possibly years of solar-powered absorption being released." He took out an X-ray chart of his diaphragm. "As far as I can tell, the quirk is mostly passive. You'd never notice he'd even had it unless in extreme instances such being wounded." Izuku began nodded frantically. Yeah. Well, I guess that makes sense. Izuku has been healing faster than normal from his accidents." A frown came across her face at his, at one point, frequent accidents. "It is also possible for him to have endless stamina when exposed to the sun," the doctor mused while stroking his chin. "Can I be a hero?" He jumped right to the matter. The doctor looked pensive. "I honestly don't know." He shrugged. Izuku's smile froze. This is the interesting part. To be honest, even I am not certain if this will be the full extent of your quirk, whether it will evolve with time or will stay as is." He shook his head. "It could go either way. Please visit again if any new developments occur. I've never actually seen a quirk like this before." Inko bowed lightly. "Thank you, doctor." After they left, Izuku was oddly silent, contemplating what the doctor told him. The truth is he didn't really care what his quirk was. Heck, he could be quirkless, and that wouldn't stop him from pursuing his dream. The problem was that to be like All Might he needed to be strong, and right now he was anything but. Kaken is going to be a hero. I need to do my best. Inko felt Izuku squeeze her hand, and almost did a double take at the fiery determination on her son's, usually cheerful or tearful face. It almost brought her to tears how much in that instance he's grown. The next 2 years were filled with mostly experimentation and research along with everyday things for Izuku. When he was allowed to, along with watching videos of his idol, he started searching for any other heroes, or even villains with a similar quirk to his own. He didn't make much progress on the latter front, unfortunately. As for the former, Izuku started to carry around a notepad to further record anything of value, though due to his age and limited vocabulary. It wasn't much, but that would change in time. After 2 years he could at least force his palms to glow for a few seconds though. It never occurred to Izuku to try out the light wave since he had no idea how that happened in the first place. As a consequence of his research, he started paying less attention to Katsuki. Since he had his own quirk problems to deal with, he couldn't be bothered to follow him around anymore. Also due to his uphill struggle with his own quirk, Izuku felt a little vindictive jealousy towards the boy and classmates who had it better due to how easily their quirks came to them. He respected his friend, whom also shared his love for All Might, and while Izuku wanted to become like his idol, he admired his friend for wanting to surpass the legendary hero. He did not, however, admire Kaken for his attitude specifically towards him, and his almost constant use of his literally explosive quirk against him. In the end, Izuku distanced himself from him while trying to maintain what's left of their friendship. Though for reasons sometimes unknown to him, there was always that bitter resentment towards his friend, for treating him so badly, for having people praising him just for what he could do naturally, for people overlooking his rotten attitude in favor of his quirk. That was also the reason why he wanted to distance himself from Katsuki. Izuku had never hated anyone before, and he'd prefer not to do it now, but he was close. It was something he didn't understand. He never thought he could dislike someone, especially his friend, but he was getting close. and Katsuki was doing nothing to make it easier. All of Izuku's work to distance himself was met with a physical altercation or mocking words, and every time Izuku's dislike grew more. By the time they were 9, Izuku had acknowledged the fact that they wouldn't be friends. He recognized that Kaken's arrogant nature, along with his superiority complex, would never allow Katsuki to truly be his friend. To most, Katsuki had seemingly given up trying to solve the mystery of Deku. They were wrong. He still kept an eye on him to try and figure out what his quirk was. That incident happened years ago, and was surely forgotten by the other two. But it was always at the back of Katsuki's mind, raising questions throughout the years. What was his quirk? Why didn't he tell anyone? Why doesn't he show it? What is he hiding? Does he think he's better than me? Whenever someone gets a quirk, it's usually all they could talk about. So far he knew everyone's quirk, except for Deku, who goes by the title of Quirkless. Katsuki knew the truth though. He wasn't dumb enough to think that Deku's sudden change of demeanor back then didn't have something to do with it. Hell, he even knew what his quirk was after asking his mom, but seeing is believing, and he wouldn't be satisfied until he actually saw Deku's quirk. So far the only other hero he had to compare with Deku's supposed quirk was an American hero who could absorb sunlight and even fire beams of radiation from his hands. If Deku's quirk was like that, then he'd definitely have to know where he stood with him. His pride refused to allow Deku of all people to be better than him, and if that idiot wouldn't willingly show them his quirk, then he'll force him to. Surprisingly, it was easier said than done, as Deku took his bullying like a champ. The injuries seemed to roll over him, and he would be fine the next day. Katsuki never injured to last, as he's almost certain Deku was covering for him. But if his mom started asking questions, then fingers would get pointed, and the last thing he wanted was to screw up his relationship with her. He didn't like Deku, but Inko was like a second mother to him, sometimes even more so than his own. He's been trying for years now, and all he got was to further alienating his friend. Not that he missed his friendship, but eventually he started seeing less and less of the boy he grew up with. Not to say he wasn't the same. He was still bright-eyed when talking about heroes, still mumbled to himself when he thinks too hard, which was downright creepy sometimes, and he kept his nose in a notebook for half the time he was seen. It was always the same book too, which made Katsuki curious. So curious, in fact, that he didn't even notice one of his followers calling out to him. "Yo, Earth," to Katsuki. When the boy didn't even acknowledge his presence, he followed his gaze to see Deku scribbling down in that notebook. It's been a while since they ever talked to him. Katsuki left him alone for a few days now, and despite the guy glaring holes at him, Deku was so preoccupied with whatever he was doing he didn't even flinch. Now the guy was curious about what he was doing. He looked at Katsuki, still glaring at him, and his lips curved in a sly smile. It's not like Katsuki has a monopoly on the guy. So without any preamble, he went over to Deku and swiped his book mid-writing, "Watcha got here, Deku." Izuku shot up. "Give it back." Startled at the steel in eyes, the boy relaxed once he saw the subtle shaking on the smaller boy's form. "Oh yeah, and what are you gonna do, Deku?" At the last word, one of his fingers extended like a spring and poked him in the forehead so hard his head jerked back. At that instant something happened, something unexpected, something unseen to the boy in front, but visible to Katsuki, though even he wasn't sure what was happening. Izuku slowly set his head down. A foreign pressure permeated the room. Katsuki's eyebrows shot up, and the boy trembled despite himself. When Izuku spoke, a chill crept up their spine. "It's mine, give it back." The boy froze wide-eyed. Izuku had his back to Katsuki, so the latter couldn't see exactly what the boy saw when he looked him in the eye, but it was enough for the boy to freeze. At this point, any chatter going on was stopped as everyone's attention turned to the seemingly overwhelming alien presence. Before anyone could do something, though, the teacher walked in, creating a distraction. During that split-second distraction, Izuku grabbed his book and sat down, deftly ignoring everyone's stares and whispers. "What just happened? Scary, did you see his eyes? I think Ryugi almost wet himself. Think that was a quirk?" "Couldn't be, he's Deku. He doesn't have a quirk, then what was that?" That last question was what Katsuki was wondering too. He never got a chance to confront him about it since he bolted from the room the moment the bell rang, not even listening to the teacher who was giving his last remarks for the day. Izuku hurried past his mother, muttering some greetings as he went, and locked himself in his room. What was that? At that moment, Izuku didn't feel completely in control of himself. It was like he was a spectator to his own action. He could see himself, how cold and malicious he was towards the other boy, and more importantly, how hollow he felt. Is this part of my quirk? No, that doesn't make any sense. How would whatever that was have anything to do with absorbing solar energy? As he asked this, there was a knock on the door, causing him to jolt. but calmed down when his mother's concerned voice called out, "Izuku, are you all right?" "Yes, Mom." The doorknob jiggled. "Did something happen at school?" "And no, I just wanted to practice with my quirk." Oh, well, dinner will be ready in an hour." "Okay, I love you, Mom," he added for good measure. "I love you too, Izuku." He heard her footsteps receding and felt horrible. He didn't like lying to her, but knowing his mother, she would blow everything out of proportion. Before that happens, he'd at least like to see if he could maybe figure out what was going on. Izuku didn't like to brag, but he was smarter than most people his age, especially when it comes to analyzing things. He figured whatever happened to him in class had to do with his quirk. The problem was that he had no idea how that happened, which frustrated him. It was just like that incident 5 years ago with the light bomb. It was spontaneous and happened when he was feeling. Well, if Izuku was being honest, he felt very angry. Izuku spent the rest of the evening trying to figure out what happened, but again his endeavors weren't rewarded. He kept thinking back to that moment when the boy called him useless Deku and poked him with his quirk. It was as if something snapped in him. That had to be it, and as much as he wanted to find a way to try and control, he was naturally reluctant to do it. In the end, he chose to forget about it for now. The final days of elementary following that incident saw the weather reported overcast skies and Katsuki's attention on Izuku again. It wasn't anything particularly new to anyone else, but for Katsuki and Izuku they could tell something was different. Izuku was becoming clearly aggravated with his bullying, something that was new to them, and while Izuku was trying to prevent things from escalating, Katsuki took it as a sign of him finally breaking Izuku. Not that it was easy, and for the next few months he pressed on with Izuku, showing more and more signs of uncharacteristic resentment. Most notable was his dark glares replacing his fearful stares, instead shaking from fear. He shook from very controlled anger, and on more than one instance he looked ready to attack Katsuki. Yet he would always rein himself in at the last minute and walk away anticlimactically. There was no doubt on anyone's mind that Izuku was like a time bomb, and even with his status as useless Deku, there was an undercurrent of fear towards the boy when tensions became high. By the end of elementary school, Katsuki was the only one who bothered to bully him, and he was only made fun of in large groups. He never paid them any mind though. He'd gotten good at ignoring his peers unless it was necessary. Soon enough Izuku became the class outcast, at least more than he was anyway. The only difference being that he was more reclusive, kept himself at the back of class on the farthest side from the window. Everyone, including the teachers, were a little perturbed by his behavior, if only because of the novelty of it, and it only increased their worries because they couldn't pinpoint the cause. It's as if one day he was normal, the next he wasn't. Not even his mother could say the change was very spontaneous and worrying. That didn't sit right with Katsuki, who overheard her conversation with his mother. "I don't know what to do," Inko half sobbed. "He doesn't talk to me anymore. I don't see him so much as smile, and he spends most of his time in his room." Mitsuki Bakugo was at a loss as to what to do. "Want me to talk to him?" "No." Katsuki didn't hate his mother, but her brand of parenting left much to be desired, and she isn't completely oblivious to how he acts. "I'm just being a worrywart. It really isn't as bad." She sobered a little. I think it may have something to do with his quirk." Mitsuki raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "I thought he could only absorb sunlight or something." Inko sighed. "I know, but I think there's more to it than that. I just know it." It ticked him off just knowing that idiot was causing trouble for Inko, so it would do some good to knock some sense into him, literally. Izuku was having an off day. Then again, all his days were off, and he'd long suspected why. He looked up to the sky, which reflected how he felt. He knew he'd sort of relied on sunlight for years now, but he'd never thought its absence would affect him this much. No, even in the past on cloudy days like this, he'd never felt so lousy. There was something going on with his quirk, but why would it start now of all times? It must have really showed, considering even his teachers were worrying about him. They never cared about me before. He had to shake those pessimistic thoughts from his head. He'd been having them a lot lately, and it's the other reason why he acknowledged that he was acting weird. Just as he was pondering his situation, mumbling under his breath as he did, so he was pulled aside, literally, and slammed into the wall. "Oi Deku, no. 𝐒𝐻𝐿. No. What the hell are you doing?" Izuku really didn't want to deal with this today. Not now, not ever. What do you mean?" He answered distractedly, while trying to find an escape route. "I have to get home." That plan ultimately failed when the 10-year-old grabbed him by the collar. "You're not going anywhere, Deku." Izuku trembled. What?" The trembling increased, and he lowered his head. "I said don't call me that. My name's Izuku, not Deku." There was a beat as Katsuki looked at the boy trembling like a leaf, who couldn't even make eye contact and laughed in his face. Izuku, still with his head down, tried to move past him. Not that he went far as Katsuki shoved him back onto the wall. "Let's get something straight here." He raised his palm, creating miniature explosions. "I'm the one with the quirk here, and you're the useless Deku." At that moment, the small light show afforded by his quirk made an almost artistic contrast against Izuku's face when he gritted his teeth and glared at him. However, instead of terrified, soft, or even hardened green eyes, Katsuki was greeted with cold, hollow, and pitch-black eyes that seemed to swallow the light shone on them. Katsuki actually recoiled slightly at the sight of such intense, empty eyes. But that was all the smaller boy needed. He pushed him off and did something that shocked them both. He punched Katsuki across the face. Reeling more from the shock than the impact, Katsuki fell on his rear, clutching his teeth. Admittedly, it was the first time Izuku had ever thrown a punch, and so he miscalculated and cut his knuckles on Katsuki's teeth. He cradled his hand with a brief look of pain crossed his features. He managed to force down the tears to glare hard at the still shell-shocked boy. "My name is Midoriya Izuku, not Deku." With that proclamation, he briskly walked away. Katsuki stared at his retreating back, the actions slowly registering, and as it did, a snarl came across his features. Izuku's heart raised. I did it. I stood up to Kaken." His silent victory was short-lived, however, when an explosion directly behind his back pushed him face first into the ground. He didn't know which one hurt more. He turned around to see an irate Katsuki stalking towards him with continuous explosions going off in his palms. "You bastard," he sneered. "You think I'm gonna just let you get away with that?" Instead of answering, Izuku palmed a clump of dirt and threw it in Katsuki's eyes. "Gah, Deku." He wiped it away, and slightly reddened eyes glared at Izuku's sprinting form. "You're dead." He ran after the boy, tossing explosions every chance he got. Izuku ran to the back of the school and into the school supply shed, which was thankfully open. Katsuki ran in a few moments after and looked around. The relatively small storage area made smaller due to the sporting equipment stored inside. "Show yourself, Deku. Get out here so I can kill you." In response, the door behind him slammed shut, causing Katsuki to spin around thinking he was locked in. To his credit, Katsuki was only half right. He was locked in, but standing before the locked door was a panting Izuku, his eyes still a perfect color of pitch. Katsuki's hands lit up again, but before he could get a word in, Izuku went over to the conveniently placed light switch. "Lights out, **, click **." No one could say for sure what happened inside the storage shed. The door was blown off its hinges. The equipments had seen better days, either completely obliterated or mangled, and battle scars littered the area, a clear sign of a destructive quirk or quirks. As for the boys, they were both found by the groundskeeper passed out from exhaustion and covered in wounds. It wasn't anything new to find children injured due to misuse of quirks, though it is up to the parents and teachers to warn them against such misuse. What made this different was the extent to which they were injured. Izuku was covered in burn marks, some doing irreparable damage to his skin. His clothes was burned, and he was covered in soot. As for Bakugo, his body was covered in cuts and bruises, some of them leaving permanent scars on his body. Neither of them were very forthcoming about what exactly happened between them, but one thing that was clear was that they had an intense dislike for each other. The fallout of the fight resulted in a rift between their families, and just like the scarring wounds on the boys' bodies, the relationship between their families was irreparable. Inko, being the woman she was, decided not to fight Mitsuki on it, and instead moved on, both figuratively and literally. And so the fragile friendship between Izuku Midoriya and Katsuki Bakugo ended. A few days later, Izuku was sitting in his new room with bandages over his arm, leg, and chest. Despite this, he had a smile on his face. He had stood up to Kaken, something of a lifelong goal for him, and while he didn't win, he knew that Katsuki will always remember, and he will never underestimate him. Barring that, there was also another development. Sitting cross-legged on the ground, his palm shone with self-composed light. A moment later, the light was snuffed out, and nothing else happened. Looking up, his smile widened when he gazed upon his shadow, writhing across the wall seemingly of its own accord. Awesome. The end. Once again, Izuku found himself sitting on a swivel chair in the doctor's office, the same doctor who diagnosed and identified his quirk before. The only difference was that the mood was a stark contrast from before. Even with his healing factor, Izuku still had bandages around his arm and part of his face. Inko was a picture of worry herself. She was still reeling from the news, not just of Izuku's fight, but the relationship between him and Katsuki. Guilt couldn't begin to describe how she felt to know that she had been ignorant of the fact that her best friend's son was bullying her own, even going so far as to use his quirk against him. It's a wonder why he changed so much. At the very least, Mitsuki apologized for Katsuki's behavior, and while they agreed on Inko's insistence to keep them separated, Inko found it hard to ever trust her friend again. As for Izuku, he had clammed up. He hadn't really talked much since then. Remorse was clearly evident on his part, and she'd even heard him crying sometimes at night. Like Katsuki, he didn't speak about what happened. He did, however, ask her if they could visit the doctor to see about his quirk again. She complied, and here they are. A solemn Izuku looked to the doctor. "Can you turn off the lights, please?" That question caught both adults off guard, though the doctor did comply, but left a lamp on to see. In the small room surrounded by darkness with only the lamp as the only source of light, Izuku held out his palm. Inko almost gasped when an inky black substance swirled into existence until it was the size of a baseball. The doctor fixed his glasses and leaned closer to observe the mass. "Extraordinary. Tell me, Izuku, since when have you been able to do this?" Izuku lowered his arm. "A few days ago, but..." He paused. He'd had a lot of time to think about it. In fact, he catalogued it in his notebook. "But I think it started 2 months ago." Inko recognized it as the time when the gloom started to creep on his face. It is rare to find someone with a photokinetic quirk. He paused, seeing their confused faces. A quirk whose ability is to emit and/or manipulate photons or light energy, if you will. It is even rarer to find its inverse, 𝗵𝗃𝗫, the ability to generate and manipulate darkness. But to combine them together. He trailed before getting up to turn on the light. "I can't manipulate light," Izuku said, but was intrigued. Yet, the doctor interjected. "You cannot manipulate light yet, Izuku. Your quirk is still in its development stage. But if what you have just shown me is any indication, then you are not that far off from discovering that ability." "What does this all mean?" Inko said worriedly. "Will Izuku be all right?" "I will not lie to you, Mrs. Midoriya. By themselves, those quirks have the potential to be truly powerful and dangerous quirks." In that instant, they truly seemed like mother and son as the worry spike reflected on both their faces. "Will Izuku be all right?" she pressed. The doctor raised his hands to placate the mother and son. "What is the extent of your control over it? Can you materialize it in sunlight?" He shook his head. "A little, but it's better in the dark," he nodded. "At the rate of growth, he wouldn't be as powerful as someone with only one of the powers, so the backlash wouldn't be as great." That was a small relief for the mother, though. "It still doesn't answer my question. Your son should be all right. I believe his current disposition is because of the emergence of his secondary quirk. In some cases, a person's quirk affects their demeanor." "Izuku is just one of many cases." Izuku nodded along, understanding the doctor's words, as the most immediate example he had was Katsuki. An explosive quirk for an equally explosive attitude. At least he confirmed the source of his strange behavior, much to his mother's relief. Does it solve the problem? Not really. But knowing is half the battle. The reason for Izuku's sudden change is due to his accessing of the darker aspects of his quirk. In order to help change his demeanor again, all he has to do is use his light powers. So I suggest prolonged exposure to the sun. He makes it sound so easy, Izuku thought, but nonetheless nodded. Izuku moved into the next town over, far away from where he lived and relatively close to a middle school. Izuku couldn't say he missed his old home. There was nothing there but torment, pent-up aggression and helplessness. And Izuku vowed he would never end up the same way again. So with his move, Izuku would start over from scratch. From this point on, he wouldn't be the useless Deku, but rather Midoriya Izuku. He will have the normal school life he deserved and real friends. No bullying, no name-calling. He would leave all of that behind. He added that to his ever-growing bucket list, right next to training his quirk. Speaking of which, Izuku was going to be on top of that throughout the rest of his middle school year. He has his eyes set on Yui Academy. No doubt Kaken would be aiming for the same. After all, if there was one thing they had in common, it was their love for All Might. He'd always said that, but Izuku hadn't really looked up the school requirements, too preoccupied with his previously unknown quirk and Kaken. Now that he had some semblance of control and access to the internet, Izuku could thoroughly research. What he found shocked him a little. The things professional heroes say about that place were many, but what stood out was how high their standards were. Yui only accepted the best, and apparently their acceptance test is grueling. In an interview, even All Might said that it was no different for him, and he still has the memories of almost not making the cut. Izuku couldn't imagine it. The #1 hero had a hard time through Yui. Izuku couldn't believe it, and even now he couldn't help but doubt it. But he's willing to take his word for it. All Might wasn't one to lie. After further research on quirk development, Izuku found another tidbit of information in that for some, the power of their quirk is dependent on the user's health. Again, another example has got to be All Might. There is no way he could have a figure like that due to his quirk. Unless it's muscle augmentation, but Izuku just didn't see that from the number of videos he's seen of him. With that information, he managed to categorize quirk growth in 2 categories, physical and mental growth. His 𝗵𝗃𝗫 would definitely fall in the latter category. It's the only explanation he has to how he could make so much progress with darkness manipulation despite showing photokinesis first. I was spending so much time trying to get my quirk to work, I didn't even bother trying to find out the proper conditions under how it would work, he grumbled in deep thought. All those late nights researching, exhausting himself and eating junk food had only succeeded in stifling his photokinetic quirk. It's like expecting a flower to grow in a toxic wasteland. Well, not a toxic wasteland, but you know what he means. A very huge blunder on his part, which cost him precious time, but something he could hopefully remedy in the years to come with a carefully constructed training regimen. A challenge it would be, no doubt. Izuku is woefully aware of how unfit he currently is. He couldn't even run a short distance, let alone pull through a full workout. But he will persevere because nothing comes without a cost. Hopefully, with the sun out, he'll be able to recover faster, thus train for longer in one sitting. As a precursor, he started by working on his stamina, which would also serve the purpose of familiarizing himself with his new neighborhood. He made sure to wear a tank top and sweat shorts to ensure his skin is exposed to as much sunlight as possible. As expected, he started running on fumes, less than 10 minutes in his jogging. At least he got an answer as to how efficient his body was at absorbing and converting solar energy into what his body needed. If he could barely last 10 minutes on a jog, that could only mean one of 2 things. Either his quirk isn't as strong or developed as he thought, or he's just that unfit and his quirk is compensating for it. He really couldn't tell which part sucks because who's to say where his energy ended and the solar-powered energy started during that relatively short jog. Not one to give up, Izuku continued his regime to the best of his ability. Every day he would start the day with a well-balanced breakfast consisting of the 5 major food groups before running until his legs collapse, sunbathe, do push-ups until his arms gave out, attempt to get a tan, do sit-ups until his sides cramped up beyond all reason, soak up some rays, do squats until his legs burn, and finish off with a light jog back to his home where he would promptly collapse in his bed until his mother woke him up for an equally balanced dinner. Afterwards, he would try not to drown himself in the shower, sleep with the blinds open, wake up at the crack of dawn, rinse and repeat. The training was tortuous, unusually cruel by his standards, and didn't show any immediate results where his photon quirk was concerned. But what he did succeed in getting, aside from cramps and soul-crushing regret, was the recognition from some of his neighbors. Apparently, there was something earnest and inspiring about a young man actually training to become a hero instead of flaunting his power. Izuku was especially popular with the older generation for this, though it could also be because of his naturally cheerful attitude and willingness to help them with anything they had trouble with. A couple of odd jobs, here and there manual labor, was also part of his training, plus doing a few favors in return for some treats is a win-win situation for him. Eventually, it was time for the start of middle school, which made Izuku put his training on pause temporarily. It wouldn't do any good to be a half-dead wreck in the middle of class. No need to make a bad first impression. They say that one person could have only so much luck at a given time, and then there's Murphy's Law, which Izuku didn't even think about. All he knew was that when he walked through the gates of his new school, he found himself feeling a sense of freedom. This was supposed to be a fresh start. It's the reason why he was all smiles when he found his homeroom. Isn't that Deku? Then the smile was wiped from his face, and ever so slowly, he turned to see who had uttered that name. His stomach dropped when he saw them. He didn't know their names, and their faces were vaguely familiar, but the fact that they know that name was cause enough for Izuku to lose any hope he had. He found the farthest corner away from them and waited for class to begin. Izuku's fight with Katsuki made headways, and with almost every school the rumors started spreading, and as it is with school spread rumors, as it gets passed around, the truth becomes more and more obscured to the point where nothing is as it seems. Judging by how they were looking at Izuku, whatever they heard wasn't good for him at all. He would find out later on that the fight wasn't a fight at all, and went more along the lines of Katsuki having one of his epic tantrums and going overboard with his beatings on Deku. By the end of the day, everyone would know that Izuku was quirkless and pretty much a useless wimp who got beat up so bad he had to move out of his neighborhood. And what does Izuku have to say to this? ****, whatever. At this point, Izuku could literally care less about what people like them thought of him. Sure, he could disprove everything by showing his quirk. That would guarantee a rise in his status, because it is unique and powerful, but really, if that is the cost of being acknowledged in this class, then Izuku would rather be an outcast. The last thing he would want is a bunch of flunkies hanging off of him like what Katsuki had. No, he'd keep his quirk to himself. Let them think whatever they want of him. At least no one tried to confront him about it. For one, though he didn't talk to the class much as Izuku didn't show the weakness he had in elementary, that was a magnet for bullies. He felt they could sense the "don't mess with me" aura he tries to exude. He may have used a little of his darkness aura to fuel the sense of dread for anyone who was trying to pick up where Katsuki left off. It didn't earn him any friends, but neither did it get him any kind of trouble, which left him free to go through the motions of school, so he could get back to training his quirk. The training eventually showed some results in his physical performance. His stamina was better. His diet contributed to a slight increase in muscle mass, which he greatly approves of when he started flexing in front of the mirror every morning. Though it wasn't much, it was progress. As for his quirk, after a semester of rigorous training, Izuku was eventually able to summon an orb of light to his palms. And that was pretty much it. It was a start, and he'd spent a week studying it and what he could do with it. The first instinct one would have with a ball of light in his hand was to throw it. But it was stuck pretty tied to his hand, and he wasn't sure if it would maintain its form away from the power source, namely him, or do what most would think and explode. There was no way he was going to take any chances with that, which means he needed a proper testing ground. Looking for a place to train your quirka? Izuku nodded to the older man as he paid for water. Izuku had pinned the kindly man's store down as a sort of halfway mark between runs. He'd always buy something to drink, and before he knew it became one of the man's regular customers. Yeah, I need somewhere to practice my quirk, so I don't destroy anything. The man nodded in approval before stroking his beard. Well, if it's space you're looking for, I know of a place, though I'm not sure it would be to your liking, but could get you some privacy, as long as you don't mind the mess. Izuku smiled. I don't think I would. All right then. What the man gave him was directions to a condemned beach. So that's what he meant by mess, Izuku muttered, as he found himself at what used to be a seaside park. There were junk piled higher than he was tall. He could also see some bobbing on the ocean currents, and honestly, he could only imagine how a once popular local destination like this ended up amounting to little more than a junkyard. That was at the back of his mind. As for what he thought of it now, it's perfect. Not only was it not too far from home, but it afforded him privacy and hopefully target practice for his quirk. Okay, so he has some expectations for what his quirk would be, but what else would it do? A little unsure of himself, Izuku decided to start with some calisthenics. Experience has told him to always limber up before doing any strenuous exercises, and he was that unsure of himself to do it. Taking a deep breath, he steeled his resolve and summoned the orb of light to his hand. He squeezed it a little. It was solid in his hand and felt warm like a miniature fire. It was something he was used to by now. Standing before a pile of trash, he positioned himself. Notebook and pen lying a few parts away next to his backpack. Here goes. He tossed the glowing orb towards the trash pile and watched with rapt attention as it shrunk mid-air, fizzled into a barely seen spark as it hit the trash pile. Huh? Getting his notebook, Izuku began scribbling down while mumbling. As expected, it wasn't able to maintain its form without a steady supply of power. And maybe if I put more into it before release, there would be a better result. He put the book down and created another orb, which shone brighter with more power. He willed into it. Okay, test number 2. He muttered and lobbed the orb. This time, the orb remained stable and made contact with the trash. There was an explosion of light that, when subsided, revealed a jagged hole in the sand, along with burned traces of trash. Whoa, he continued to stare until he broke out into a huge smile. Yes. After a short victory dance, he scribbled down in his notebook again possible ways to utilize the attack, a name, and so forth. The testing was a success. Not only could he manifest light, he could attack with it. Izuku would admit he got the idea from Kekken. That guy's been tossing his quirk around so much sometimes at him that it was unavoidable to copy him. For a moment, he entertained the thought of tossing a grenade of light at him just to see how he liked it. Hen-light grenade. He wrote it down as a possible name. Then a thought occurred. Was an attack like that safe to use against people? He would more than likely use it against villains, but villains were people too, and the last thing he wanted was to maim someone. Taking a look at the hole, he pursed his lips and made another orb exactly as the first one, except he lowered the power output by half and tossed it into another pile of junk. There was a bright shine, but more of a pop than an explosion that had Izuku squint his eyes. But by the time it was over, the trash pile was merely singed and a bit displaced. Well, that didn't work. He wrote it down. Aside from a flashy light show, there wasn't much damage. He took a deep breath and tried again, this time lowering it by roughly a quart, then tossed it. There was a bright shine followed by an explosion. However, the hole left by was less deep, and the trash wasn't completely incinerated. Another success, and Izuku made sure to note the power of each grenade, delay time and result. He wiped the sweat from his brow and looked at it. If that didn't prove how taxing the power could be, then he didn't know what did. As nightfall came, Izuku switched it up, and just as it was every time he did, the warm feeling he had turned cold. Not chillingly, more like the cold of night air creeping on his bare chest. It wasn't uncomfortable, just noticeable, and Izuku had long accepted this. After all, it was his quirk, a part of him. A lot of people would note the duality of his power, much like his mother did at first, but really it was still Izuku. Sure, when he activated his darkness cloak, everything about him would become just a bit more gloomier, but it was still him. It's not like he'd turn evil just because he could manipulate darkness. At least he hoped not. He shook his head. Focus. The reason why he did this was to start the second part of his quirk training, but Izuku had the advantage of practice. Since his darkness manipulation had nothing to do with his physical performance, Izuku had been able to train with it in his room for months now. However, this would be the first time he had to use it in a wide area. He checked the time, looked out to the sea. All right, just like with his light, he formed a black orb and stretched it out to wrap around a random piece of trash and yank it with all his strength. With his other hand, he made another black orb, launched at the oncoming object, and smashed it away. Next, he clenched his fist, and the black orbs extended to make a crude and cartoonish giant hammer, and turning towards a fridge, he started battering it down. Within minutes, the rusted refrigerator was dented and deformed. Aside from the slight strain of moving his arms, Izuku was not the worse for wear. Just as I thought, it is easier. Izuku was a thinker by heart. For what he lacked in physical prowess, he more than made up for it in his mental aptitude. Problem solving, critical thinking, it all came easy for him. It's the reason why he's top of his class. For a quirk whose strength owes a big part to his mental fortitude, it was only natural that he was better at it than with its light counterpart. He could have manifested it in the day if he wanted to. He'd been able to for weeks now, but it wasn't as strong as it was at night. Not to mention, he needed to make a comparison between them, and just as he'd used the light side to the best of his abilities, he needed to use the dark to that effect as well. This continued for the rest of the first semester, and all the way through the second semester, and before he knew it, the first year was over. School went by in a relative blur for Izuku. He continued with his training, practiced with his quirks, and studied mostly because it was the only way he knew how to increase his mental prowess. In a way, it's a good and bad thing. On one hand, he was able to maintain his spot in the top 10 of his class. On the other hand, he wasn't winning any favors with his more vindictive, academically inept classmates. Not that he really cared. The days of curving his studies to suit the egos of others was over. At the end of the year, Izuku scored within the top 20 in his year. A sizable amount of the junk at the seaside park was incinerated, and any junk within 15 meters of the shoreline was pulled from the sea. All in all, Izuku had a very productive first year of middle school. People become heroes for a lot of reasons in this day and age. Some do it because of purely altruistic reasons, others for the accolades, or to accomplish a sense of achievement. And even though he absolutely hated it, Izuku acknowledged that there are those who do it for the money and fame. Constantly searching for heroes on the internet, he's seen his fair share of scandals involving heroes. He accepted that not all heroes were as infallible as All Might. Izuku, of course, fell into the former category. He never saw being a hero as a job, or wanted any great achievement other than saving lives and putting the villains behind bars. Of course, it all stemmed from watching All Might all these years. The man was more than just Izuku's idol. He was Izuku's example of how a hero should be. And while Izuku wouldn't think he could ever be as buff as All Might or smile as bright, he would do all he could to follow in the man's footsteps. That is why it is understandable that while he was jogging back home at night as a cool down from another workout session and came upon a particular scene, he would take a particular course of action. "You bitch." There was the sound of something hitting flesh, and a body flew from the corner and crashed into the wall and slumped to the ground. Ugh! Izuku's eyes widened when he saw a girl only a few years older than him, wearing a school uniform, slam into the wall before him. Before he could get a good look at her, someone else stomped into view. He was a teenage Yakuza type with a nasty quirk to match. Sharp needle-like quills jutted all over his body. They went through his tank top and jeans, leaving them full of pin-sized holes on his body. The man didn't seem to notice Izuku, who was still frozen in shock, as he addressed the girl. "You think you could get the drop on me, huh?" He fired off some quills from his wrist at the girl, causing her to yelp. That was the last straw for Izuku. "I'm gonna kill you, huh?" Before he could finish his sentence, a glowing yellow orb dropped at his feet. "What in the hell?" Boom! The concussive blast sent the man flying a few feet away, where he landed painfully on his back. Izuku took that chance to run into the fray. A shadow tendril wrapped around the recovering thug's leg, and Izuku tossed him to the side of a wall. When the thug didn't get up, Izuku went to check on the girl, who could only stare at him with an expression foreign to him. Are you okay?" Her eyes trailed down, and Izuku followed before cringing and mentally chiding himself for the dumb question. 2 long quills were embedded in her body, one in her shoulder and another in her forearm, which she slowly pulled out with a grunt. Izuku felt sick seeing the blood flowing from the wounds and fumbled for his phone. He needed to call the police, but first he'll call an ambulance to get her taken care of. Before he could even get the third number dialed, a scream tore through his mouth and caused him to drop the phone. Izuku staggered at the white-hot pain that erupted in his back. He cried again when another kind of pain laced at his shoulder, and finally another at his leg, which caused him to finally drop to his knees. Shakily, he looked behind him to see the red-faced teenager's outstretched hand. He had a bruise on his face. "You piece of shit." It almost made Izuku lock up in terror, but a glance at the girl caused him to keep it at bay and stagger to his feet. That's when a kick to his side knocked the air out of him. He ended up landing on his back, but rolled over to his side and clutched his stomach in a fetal position. He yelped when the teen stomped painfully on his side. "Who the hell are you?" Izuku coughed for a response and tried to shift his body to protect his head. "You with that bitch, huh?" Izuku was lifted up to come face to face with his attacker. "You her boyfriend or something? Come to help her take me out." Izuku had no idea what he was talking about, and he didn't care as small quills poked out his face, and he delivered a brutally painful headbutt. Izuku's entire mind exploded in pain, and in reflex he formed a pair of light balls in his palms and shoved them into the attacker's chest. There was a blinding light, and the attacker's scream of pain was drowned out by the ensuing explosion that blasted them apart. Izuku landed on his back, and consequently the quills embedded there, but they were at best a nuisance compared to the damage to his face and the concussive shockwave of the blast. For a moment Izuku couldn't see anything. He couldn't hear anything, and the only thing he felt was pain, then darkness. Literally, he started to subconsciously draw on the dark side of his powers. He wanted the pain gone. He wanted it to stop, and slowly the pain numbed like running water over a burn. It was soothing, and after a moment he gathered his bearings and staggered to his feet. He blinked a few times to get his vision straight, and saw the man with his shirt, now burnt, getting up as well. "You," he snarled. "I'm gonna kill you for 𝗧𝗏." Izuku cut him off with a well-placed tendril wrapped around his foot, and started slamming him into the ground. *bam********. Slam****. He paused, then slammed him down 2 more times, just to make sure he stayed down. Fact: people with transmutation quirks tend to be more durable. *pant***. Izuku took a tentative step forward, but dropped to a knee when a spike of pain shot up his leg. "Oh right. He got me in the leg." Izuku willed it, and darkness covered his leg, and he watched a little fascinated as the quill was pushed out of his skin. He will be writing that tidbit down. He did the same to the others before breathing a sigh of relief. Then he remembered the girl, and his gaze reached her, hey, only to find that she was gone. When did she leave? How did she leave with that wound? Izuku wasn't a medical expert, but he's pretty sure she wouldn't have been able to slip away so silently with wounds like that. Was her quirk some kind of healing ability? That still doesn't explain why she left. But after thinking about it for a moment, he shook his head and limped over to his phone. 911. What is your emergency? Izuku. Inko opened the door to see her son lying in the hospital bed, looking like a deer caught in the headlights. Rather than watch his expression, she took stock of the bandages covering his face, hand, and leg. Mom, it's really not as bad as it looks. It was far too late for reassurance, though. Wow, my baby. Inko crossed the room so fast people would be mistaken about her quirk, and Izuku soon found himself smothered in a hug. After a moment of wailing came the rapid-fire questions. Are you all right? Who did this to you? How did this happen? I would like to know the same thing as well. Mother and son turned to see a man in a trench coat take off his hat as he closed the door. He had a friendly, if plain, face as he regarded them. Who might you be? Inko asked, and Izuku felt her clutch him just a little tighter. My name is Officer 𝗧𝗏𝗄𝐻. I already answered some questions, sir. I know. I'm not here to ask about the fight. Rather, I would like to know the identity of the girl you allegedly saved. I'm sorry. I don't know her. She left before I could talk to her. The man took out a notepad. You said she was injured? Oh yeah. He got her in the leg with one of his quills. About this girl? You said that she wore a school uniform, right? Yeah, Izuku nodded. At his grave expression, 𝐭 asked, "What is it?" Over the past month, there has been a reported increase in the number of assaults in that region. The victims were all teenage boys, and the one thing they all had in common was that the perpetrator was a young girl in a school uniform. Sound familiar? Izuku sputtered in shocked confusion. But I saw her get attacked. According to Yamaha, the boy you fought, he said she was the one to attack him first with a box cutter, and that he was acting in self-defense. He had defensive wounds on his hands, which supports his story. Now, I'm not saying that Yamaha is an innocent, however, based on the evidence presented, he was the victim in this instance. 𝗏 turned a worried glance to her son Izuku. He didn't hear her and looked away, reeling from the news. "I let a villain get away," he mumbled, but it was clearly heard by the other occupants of the room. It was an honest mistake. Really? You saw a defenseless girl being attacked, and you assumed what any other person would. Izuku didn't respond. What were you doing out there anyway? I was training. You want to be a hero, don't you? At Izuku's nod, he chuckled a little. I'm not surprised. A lot of kids these days want to be heroes. He frowned a little. It's not my place to judge, but you should be careful about what your expectations are. Being a hero isn't as glamorous as some make it to be. There is a fine line between bravery and recklessness. Not to say that taking a decisive action is necessarily bad, but it's always best to think things through before you act. Izuku was still silent, but now he was looking at the officer. Is there anything else, sir? No, I just wanted to warn you to be careful. We don't know how this person operates, so it's best to go home earlier from now on. Needless to say, the entire ordeal had Izuku question himself. His keen yet still young analytical mind that would be used to observe others was now turned inwards as he introspected. He had always prided himself on being a person who thinks things through, except he didn't. Not this time around, and admittedly, this wasn't the first time something like this happened. Well, it was his first life and death situation, but it felt eerily familiar. He'd spent a good portion of the following day thinking about it, and he found the connection. He could distantly remember the first time his quirk manifested. He was actually shocked it took him so long to make the connection, as that day was ingrained in his mind in perfect clarity. Just like that time, he rushed into a confrontation without thinking it through and got himself beaten up for it. Instead of, say, calling an adult over to break up the fight, he went to fight himself despite knowing he didn't have a chance. Did he regret his decision? No, he did not, and it wasn't because the action resulted in his quirk manifesting. The regret was that he didn't even consider an alternative, and not just tattling so someone else could deal with it. He literally had no plan aside from getting in front of Kaken and hoping things work out. It was the same this time around. Izuku's body reacted before his brain could think of anything, and by the time it caught up, he had already thrown a light grenade. Why did that happen? The first time around he manifested his quirk, but he still ended up taking a beating from Kaken, not to mention ending up on the boy's personal shit list for the years to come. This time he prevented someone from getting killed, but in the act he got a beating again. Beat up the apparent victim, even though he deserved it. Let the bad guy or girl free to assault more people, and ended up on some guy's personal shit list again. He didn't regret his decision, but the fact that he didn't even bother to consider making an actual plan bothered him the most. Who knows what that girl would have done if she wasn't injured? He shivered thinking about it. Izuku had to put off training for a week in order to allow his wounds to heal, which took roughly 2 days with his accelerated healing factor, but decided to take a few extra days to ease his mother's worry. Izuku wasn't upset by that. He too was worried, and there weren't any late-night assaults, which could be both good and bad at the same time. Eventually, though, Izuku got a little stir-crazy with so much free time after developing his schedule to include training. He managed to get his mother to acquiesce for the weekends at the very least, since the girl apparently operated on school nights. It was a start. So it was with that Izuku made his way to the seaside park training ground. Compared to when he found it, there were few garbage bags around. Somewhere last year, he decided to make his training something of a public service, especially since his stronger light attacks tend to leave nothing but easily cleanable scorch marks. Even now, he could see the soot marks on the sand from the times a light grenade exploded, taking along a few years of waste. As of now, mostly scrap metal too tough to be incinerated was left. To his left was a rusted old open-back truck piled with various scrap metal he heaped on via shadow manipulation. Or was it darkness manipulation? Sometimes he got the two mixed up, considering his shadow is a form of darkness. He blew a breath. Okay, let's get started. Immediately he dropped and started doing 50 push-ups, sit-ups and squats. It took him a while, But eventually, he formulated a workout routine that maximizes not only his physical exercise, but also his quirk usage, taking into consideration the extra energy afforded to him via solar absorption and night augmentation. After the not too intense physical workout, he went on with practicing with his quirk. He would like to think he was now comfortable with his dual powers, though he knew he was far from mastering them. For what he knew of his quirk from experience was that his light powers are dependent heavily on his physical state. The more fit he was, the more he will be able to use it. Overuse would result in physical exhaustion that could and did result in him passing out. For his dark powers, it's naturally stronger at night, and is dependent on his intelligence, and also his emotional state. He found out the latter part after he attempted to overuse it in the day of course. He thought he would get something like a massive headache, but instead he got more aggressive, pessimistic, and moody. Another thing he noted was although the darkness became weaker the more it's used, the quality improved as his mind descended. In the end, he had enough semblance to switch over to his light powers and filter out the excess angst. That was an experience. Now that the thought had come up, he couldn't help but compare the two powers, though to be honest there isn't much of a comparison other than the fact he could generate them out of thin air. They both handled differently, causing Izuku to take different approaches with them. He could produce light like a flash, explosive, and in theory blast it like a laser, though he hadn't been able to yet. The most he could do was a close-range scatter blast reminiscent of a sawed-off shotgun. As for darkness, he could manipulate it into objects, or move it into an attack. He can't blast darkness, but he can shroud things like a net and levitate them. This time around, as an experiment, he will attempt to manifest them both at once. To be honest, he was very reluctant to do this, but depending on the result, he'd want to know what could happen. Izuku was curious enough to want to explore everything he can about his very unique quirk. After all, the more you know. He held up his palms and gulped, "Please don't go wrong." With that, he manifested a light orb in one palm and attempted to summon a dark ball in the other. Already he could feel a kind of strain. His temperature fluctuated a little, and a bead of sweat rolled down his face. It was like his body was attempting to pull to one of the two opposing forces, but he kept it even. Then something unexpected happened. The two orbs started pulling together. Izuku strained further as his hands were compelled closer until the orbs combined above his cupped hands. At this point Izuku was panting, but he ignored the fatigue to stare at the pure black ball with a glowing white center. Izuku was in complete awe of his creation. A wide smile split his face. "I did it! Crack. The smile vanished as a crack appeared, trailing light veins on one side of the black marble. Another crack occurred, this time within the light marble, spilling black veins. At that point Izuku knew his control was slipping, and thinking fast, he tossed the ball near the truck. Amazingly, it rolled underneath it, and Izuku ran behind garbage cover to brace himself for the mother of all explosions. But none came, and instead he was treated to a short hum, then silence. After a moment, he lifted his head from cover to view the result of the power breakdown. His jaw promptly dropped at the sight, or rather a lack thereof, as most of the truck was gone. The sand and part of the front of the truck had a curve. It was as if a perfect sphere was carved through the truck. Izuku had a good idea what exactly happened. He approached the truck to get a closer look, and even touched the groove of the newly carved truck. It was a perfectly smooth curve. It was as if it was designed like that. Amazing. There were no marks, no burns, no smell. If Izuku's didn't know what it looked like before, he would have that it was some weird piece of abstract art. No doubt it was dangerous and taxing, yet Izuku couldn't help but want to try again. But first I need to write this down. He turned around and got his book, Fusion of Dark and Light Powers, a success. We'll have to try again with adjusted power. He paused and think of possible name. That was his favorite part, naming special attacks. Wow! Izuku tensed and spun around to see a girl with her back turned observing the truck. Then she spun around with hands relaxed behind her back, feet rocking slightly. Cat-like eyes zeroed on him as a small smile adorned her face that also had a healthy flush. That was really cool. So, you working on your quirk? Izuku could only stare at her gobsmacked, wondering who she was, how and when she got there, and is she talking to me? On instinct, he looked behind him just to see if by some incredible coincidence that someone was behind him. No one was there, and Izuku turned to see her looking right at him with a fusion of amusement and something that was foreign to him. Girls don't really talk to him willingly except his mother, and he wasn't pining for attention, either, considering how utterly terrible he was with dealing with them. Case in point. You don't have to answer that, I could tell, she stage whispered. Was it just him, or was she blushing? Izuku began sputtering, but was silenced as she continued. I never saw a quirk that could do that before. She traced the contours of the truck. What kind of quirk is it anyway? She eyed him curiously. Izuku blinked at the question to really get a good at her, then remembered his earlier thoughts. Why, you were watching me? She stared for a moment before her eyes crinkled. Yeah, I couldn't help but notice how cool you look back there. A girl called me cool. They both turned even more red, though Izuku's was a few shades deeper. It was nothing, he managed to squeak out. That's not true. I think you're interesting. And she meant it, he could tell. He averted his gaze. He never thought it would be so difficult to take a compliment from a girl. Thanks. Himiko Toga. 𝗵𝗲𝗄𝗧𝗔𝗂𝗍 Izuku. Her smile widened. Izuku. Izuku tugged at his collar. Is it getting warmer? Himiko-san. The girl pouted. That's not fair, Izuku. You shouldn't use any honorific either. Izuku began to panic a little when she began advancing on him. He almost took a step back. She leaned down too close for Izuku's comfort, peered into his eyes and said, Now say my name, Toga. Toga-san. She smiled again and Izuku felt a chill down his spine. Instincts took over, and this time he did take a step back. I have to go. He still had 2 hours, but he didn't think he would be able to concentrate with her there. The disappointment was clear on her face. Already? I thought you had more time. I promised my mom I would go home early. That early was still 2 hours away, but she didn't need to know that. Toga shrugged. Guess it can't be helped then. She smiled. See you next time, Izuku. Why, yeah, he said awkwardly and walked away a little faster than necessary. The next day Izuku arrived at the seaside park to see a familiar face. Himiko-san. Again the girl pouted. I told you before, Izuku, it's Toga, just Toga. Is it really that hard to say my name? She asked with a tilt of her head. Izuku averted his gaze and mumbled something. But we just met yesterday, he argued, surprised he didn't stutter. Then I guess we'll just have to get to know each other, Izuku. We will? She gave an impish grin, showing her pointed canines. Yep, you'll get to know stuff about me, and she paused to look at him with slightly glazed eyes. I'll learn everything about you. For some reason that declaration had Izuku nervous, and not in the embarrassed way. Before he could speak, she turned around. Come on, I'll help you train. Izuku stood where he was for a moment. He may not have much experience talking to girls, but he knew a setup when he saw one, and for whatever reason he couldn't help but feel she had an ulterior motive. So it was with that Izuku spent the day with the taller girl, and true to her word, she did help him. In her own way, which was mostly keeping his mind distracted from the pain of his labor, with her never-ending chatter while keeping count. Even though he hung onto his suspicion like a life raft out at the raging sea that was Himiko Toga, there was something fresh about having a girl cheering him on. He'd always heard about how that could have an effect on guys, but didn't believe it. The proof was in the pudding when he didn't even notice he did 20 extra push-ups, sit-ups and squats. Yet he still had enough energy to do quirk training. Speaking of which, it was during the middle of said training that Himiko decided to ask. Have you ever been in a fight? Izuku paused. The shadow did as well. A few times. Why? He's been in a few fights, but had a record going for the one-sided beatdowns. Well, I think if you're preparing to be a hero, you should know how to fight. I know how to fight, he defended, remembering his time against Yamaha the porcupine. Toga's expression was unreadable before she said, Show me. She got up from where she sat and approached him. Show me how you fight. I can't. Why? Izuku sputtered for a moment, trying to find the words. Why you could get hurt. Toga's response was to laugh, much to his confusion. Don't worry about me, Izuku. I can take care of myself. But, Izuku, she interrupted, do you want to hurt me? No, he answered immediately. She tilted her head, expression unreadable. That's too bad, because I definitely want to hurt you. ****. At the end, Himiko gave a deranged smile and produced a box cutter out of nowhere before charging at the stunned team. Izuku stepped back and tripped over his feet as Himiko slashed. He landed on his rear and felt his cheek. Drawing back his hand, he saw blood. The wound itself was shallow enough to heal in the sunlight, and Toga smiled wider as she continued the assault, straddling him. You're so cool, Izuku. I bet you'd look even cooler covered in blood. Just as she stabbed down, there was a bright light, and she flew off and landed a few feet away. She sat up to see a panic-stricken boy with 2 light orbs in each palm. She stared at him for a minute before bonking her head. Oops, I guess I overdid it. She got up and dusted her skirt before clasping her hands and bowing. Sorry for freaking you out like that. I saw a villain do that once, and I thought it would look believable if I tried since I'm a villain, but I got into it a little too much. She gave an awkward chuckle. Izuku didn't move, but after a moment of staring at her bashful form, she fidgeted awkwardly and the light orbs dissipated. "Are you okay?" "Yeah. I'm really sorry, it's okay," was the automatic response, but Izuku wasn't okay. He was so far from okay that he reached orbit. Cautiously, he walked over to his bag, making sure to keep her in his line of sight. "I have to go," he mumbled, already getting his bag. "Oh, I understand," she smiled at him, but Izuku was too shell-shocked to get flustered by it. He walked away briskly by. He turned to see her give a jaunty wave, which Izuku tentatively returned before walking out of view and running the rest of the way home. The moment he left, her eyes glazed over a little and her smile widened before bringing the box cutter to her face, and after admiring the red liquid smeared on it, she dragged her tongue over the blade and licked up the speckle of blood before shuddering in ecstasy. Cupping her cheeks to fight down the growing blush, her glazed-over eyes looked to the moon as she whispered, "Catch you later, 𝐼𝐳𝐼𝐴𝐼𝐴𝐼𝐴𝐼𝐴𝐼𝐴𝐼𝐴𝐼𝐴𝐼𝐴𝐼𝐴𝐼𝐴𝐼𝐴𝐼𝐴𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼𝐼 because most children his age would jump at the chance to get out of school. In fact, some of them actually did. Literally jumped out the door a moment after the bell rang using a quirk that allowed their legs to coil up like springs. Sighing in resignation, Izuku packed his bags slowly and with trepidation. He was seated near the back of the class dead center, an ideal place that's not too far for him to be distracted by some of the seedier happenings the teacher is unaware of, yet not so close that said teacher notices when he makes some jotting in his other notebook. Not that anyone really pays attention to him anyhow. He still retains his title of quirkless, so as far as anyone is concerned, he's not worth the time spared. Or so he would like to believe. But as of late, he has been getting some unwanted attention. Thankfully, it is only for this time of the day, but it still nonetheless irked him. In the end, he resigned to his fate with a sigh, slung his backpack on, and trudged out the door with the enthusiasm of a man on death row. He kept his head low more so, because he was in thought than he was trying to avoid anyone's eyes. Izuku wasn't famous so much as he was infamous for not having a quirk, but he was such a wallflower who was coincidentally popular with the teachers that people didn't antagonize him. As he walked out, his green eyes warily scanned the gate leading outside the school. To his mortification, he was not to be spared today either. Leaning by the gate with legs crossed, messenger bag held before them by both hands, smile in place, while probably humming a tune was the cause of his current distress. Her eyes flickered to him, and she broke out into a grin that had him brace himself. Izuku. The shout drew looks from the surrounding students, and Izuku ducked his head, a fierce blush permeating his face. His steps hurried until he was outright running. Izuku wasn't one to stand out. Years of living in Katsuki's shadow made him avoid the spotlight. This situation was anything but ideal for him, so he wanted to be as far away from school as possible. "Hey, wait up, Izuku." He could hear her trying to catch up to him. But Izuku had been running long distance, relentlessly almost every day for almost a year and a half. If he couldn't outpace her, then either she had a speed quirk, or he was wasting his time training. Izuku ended up running straight towards the seaside park without stopping. He was winded, but nowhere near tired. The same couldn't be said for his pursuer, who ended up having to lean against the rails as she wheezed. "That was mean, Izuku, running away like that." She looked at him, her face flushed. He would have thought from the run, but he's come to realize that her face was always flushed for some reason. "Sorry, I just needed tea to get away from his school." He averted his gaze. He hated stuttering like that. He'd built up his confidence a lot since he moved. But that was in general, and unfortunately talking to girls without getting tongue-tied was a work in progress. Talking to Himiko was even worse, because she comes on strong, and was almost always smiling. She sprung up. "It's okay. We should get started on your training." Before Izuku could reply, his hand was grabbed, and he was pulled down to the beach. She comes on very strong. Izuku's relationship with Himiko was a complicated one. While Izuku would like to have a friend, Himiko was, for lack of a better term, too good to be true. Izuku had been thinking about how he would approach things ever since his incident with that gangster a month ago. He'd start off observing people from a distance, beginning with his classmates, since they were the most convenient. One of the things he learned about himself was that his perception of a situation affected how he would react. There couldn't be a better example than the incident itself. At first glance, it looked like the man was assaulting an innocent girl. It also didn't help that he looked like, and in fact was, a delinquent, while the victim was a nondescript girl. Izuku saw the situation as a classic hero save the damsel in distress type situation and sprung into action, while ignoring what the man was saying, accusing her of. Izuku greatly chided himself when he realized he was given sufficient clues to deduce something was wrong with the situation in the first place, but he ignored it in favor of stopping the villain. As it relates to Himiko, At first it was pretty obvious to him why she wanted to hang out. Katsuki had 2 followers because of his quirk being literally flashy and explosive. Izuku could emit, manipulate and combine light and darkness, a possibly flashier, more explosive not to mention rare quirk. That's what he thought at first, but Himiko didn't look particularly drawn to his quirk other than fascinated or impressed. She spent the entire day afterwards helping him train and cheering him on, all the time with a smile on her face and a blush on her cheeks, the latter of which he matched every time their eyes met. Izuku started to wonder if she was dare he say it actually interested in him. Again, it sounded too good to be true, but at that point he was giving her the benefit of the doubt. Then she asked him to spar with her, and any preconceptions he had was shattered when she pulled a knife out of nowhere and cut his cheek open. Granted, it was shallow enough for it to heal within minutes, but what had him truly frightened was the look on her face. The way her eyes dimmed, how wide her smile was, and the absolute glee in her voice when she tried to stab him. She said it was an act and tried to laugh it off, but Izuku wasn't convinced for a minute. In fact, the way how she laughed it off made him even more suspicious of her. Izuku would never again let his guard down around her, which was fortunate because she showed up every day afterwards to hang out. Since she remained adamant about copying whatever it was the previous day from something she saw a villain do, he decided to ask her which villain it was. He never did get an answer. Days turned into weeks with Izuku silently observing Himiko through their growing friendship, and he came to the conclusion that she was most definitely weird, and not because she actually wants to befriend him for reasons not quirk-related. With that said, he couldn't help but suspect she was after something, but what it is he couldn't figure out. The only thing unique about him was his quirk. He wasn't rich, didn't have any connection to any rich famous person, hero or villain, and his personality is about as interesting as a hero fanboy nerd. All of it should point out that he had nothing to worry about, but the uncertainty was always there. He couldn't help but compare her to Katsuki despite the fact that she acts the complete opposite of him. But it was her eyes. Sometimes he caught her looking from the corner of his eyes when she thought he wasn't, and what he saw frightened him. It has been close to a month since they've known each other, and though he is less frightened and more used to her quirky attitude, he is not too trusting of her even now. Especially considering she still carries around a box cutter strapped to her thigh for reasons. He was honestly too afraid to ask why she did, but he'd give her the benefit of the doubt. It's not like he could judge people for being weird, just look at him. Forgetting what he didn't know about her, Izuku had gotten to know a lot about her. The most obvious is that she attends a private middle school located several blocks away. She's apparently an only child, and while her family is well off, her parents are usually too busy to be there, often leaving her to her own devices, which is apparently hanging out with him for most of her free time. Excluding his precarious relationship with Himiko, Izuku continued to hone his quirk. Izuku feels he has at least mastered the basics of his quirk, able to form light and dark at any time he so chooses. That doesn't mean he's slacking off though. There is always work to be done and a new goal to be set to achieve. This time Izuku wanted to master a little technique he called void release, by far the most dangerous and lethal aspect of his quirk, the fusion of his light and dark powers. It's the reason why he's still trying so hard in his physical exercises, as to make a single void ball is so taxing that he would feel like he did a marathon afterwards, and the misery would creep in at the edge of his mind. The ball itself was barely enough to fit into his palm, yet the power behind it was devastating. It wasn't that the objects he threw the void ball at were destroyed so much as they ceased to exist. The few times he's tried proved that it was without a doubt the single most unstoppable force since All Might. Nothing was safe. Metal, sand, even the water itself were erased from this world when it comes into contact with it, oftentimes leaving a ball-shaped hole that fills up with water after a few seconds. The true danger and cause for training is its stability. With each void ball, Izuku had about 5 seconds to throw it at something, or it would blow up in his face, and considering how things ended up, he did not want to be caught in that explosion. Some people are immune to their quirk's power, but Izuku isn't dumb enough to believe it applied to him. The few close calls he'd had with that particular aspect made him only attempt void control once or twice every few weeks as a measure of his progress. Since it relies on both aspects of his quirk, Izuku could say that it was the best way to do so. It also has the added bonus of clearing away some of the tougher garbage on the beach. Currently, Izuku is proud to say at least half the total garbage on the beach has been cleared. He is also proud to note that he is no longer a walking fishbone, but that was for another time, namely when he's flexing in front of his bathroom mirror in the morning. Still, he gave his arm an experimental flex, and felt the modest muscle build up and grinned to himself. Meanwhile, Himiko grinned at Izuku, grinning. It was clear what he was doing. and she found it so adorable she had to grab her cheeks to cool them down. It's been a month now since she has met the short, kind, smart, adorable boy that was Midoriya Izuku. A month consisting of watching, talking, awkward stutters on Izuku's part, blushing on both their parts, and so much smiling. Himiko can't remember the last time she'd ever been so happy being around someone without her compulsions acting up. She'd swear to herself that she would learn everything about Midoriya Izuku because she liked him, because she wanted to be like him, because she wanted to become him. But after a month, she's starting to wonder if that is a good idea. Looking at him now, earnestly working on his quirk, could she really be like him? Himiko is a great many things: mysterious, slightly ditzy, strange, cute, dangerous, and maybe just a little unhinged. But he didn't need to know about that last part. Not that he isn't sufficiently paranoid to have his guard up through her sincere attempt to befriend him. Oh, she's noticed that too. Not that it was hard to see, nor was it not well deserved. She did acknowledge she was dangerous after all. Yet it said something about someone who's willing to give her the benefit of the doubt and be nice to her even after she cut him, and she stared dreamily off in the distance for a bit before shaking her head no. Bad Himiko, she chided herself. Now that she thought of it, back then was more of a Pyrrhic victory since she ended up shattering his tentatively good first impression of her with that single impulsive action. In her defense, she couldn't help it. The thought of seeing him all bloody and damaged after a hard battle still sent a pleasant chill down her spine. For once Himiko took her eyes off of him and looked to the sky. It's not like I was wrong, she did have a point about combat back then, but it was such a disaster she doubted he could ever trust her to that effect again, which really sucks because she knows it would benefit him, and if he gets a few cuts in the process, then it's a bonus. But how do I convince him? Himiko wasn't as dumb as she let on. Izuku will never fight her. She couldn't be playful with it. She could appeal to his logic, but rather than fight her, he would just find some other way to accomplish it. One of the things she admired about him was that under his diminishing insecurities was ingenuity and drive to accomplish his goals. But she wanted to fight him. She needed to know where he stood. Sure, having a powerful quirk helps, but as she saw in an old movie once, even the most powerful quirks will lose against someone with better skills. Screw it. This is for his own good anyway. Izuku inadvertently shivered, which was quite a feat since he was directly in sunlight while using his light powers. Then he realized something vital, something so important that he kicked himself for forgetting. He took his eyes off Himiko. Spinning around Izuku was just in time to see Himiko liberating the box cutter strapped from her thigh while lifting her skirt to get it. For a moment Izuku thought he saw a flash of her no. Evil thoughts begone. He admonished fiercely. Toga-san, what are you doing? She frowned and looked a little exasperated. I told you, you don't need to add any honorifics, Izuku. Just Himiko will do. And I'm getting ready for our spar. This was pronounced when she extended the blade in the box cutter. Izuku's eyes widened, and he took an involuntary step back. Maybe we shouldn't. It's for your own good. How are you supposed to be a hero if you don't know how to fight? Izuku winced. He had been meaning to do something about that, preferably after she got bored with him and move on to watch some other guy train in the sun. That doesn't mean I have a death wish, he thought, eyeing the box cutter warily. Himiko saw this, and it took a moment before she let out a long "oh" and bonked her head duh. To his shock, she tossed the offensive weapon away and stretched a little before settling into what Izuku would guess was a fighting stance. Okay, I'm ready. Izuku stared at her in confusion. For some reason he glanced behind him, as if there was some other guy she was referring to, which in hindsight was a mistake on his part. He turned around just in time to see Himiko's palm inches from his face, where he closed his eyes at the last second. Smack. Oh. After clutching his face, Izuku found himself falling to his back, and shortly after something heavy landed on his chest. He looked up to see two fingers pointed dead center of his eyes. You lose. The fingers were removed to reveal Himiko's smiling face with a customary red tinge Izuku was convinced was some kind of medical condition. Or maybe she felt the way he did, because he immediately noticed their position before his face burned crimson. Sputtering a mile a minute, he tried to extricate himself from under her, but she waved a finger in front of his face. Sorry, Izuku, but I'm a villain, remember? You're a hero, so you'll have to use your quirk to fight me. But... She pressed a finger to his lips and adopted a serious expression. Izuku, you can't put off fighting me forever. I mean, the next villain you face might kill you, you know? Izuku paled at her words. It was especially unsettling with how blasé she delivered them. He thought back to his first fight and winced a little bit. Truthfully, that guy wasn't even a villain, just some delinquent, and, in hindsight, he wasn't all that threatening. At least not if Izuku had used his quirk to its fullest capacity. He knew a little better now, but it wasn't anything to brag about, and should something like that happen again. Izuku turned his gaze away for a moment. Face still red, but no longer burning. Maybe just this once, he muttered. She fought down the face-splitting grin that gave Izuku nightmares and cheered, "Great. Now for your first lesson. Try to get yourself free." He didn't have to hear that twice, and it took no time at all as once Himiko saw his bright green eyes dim, and she rolled off of him just in time to escape a shadow tendril. She ran backwards when he pressed the attack to gain some distance. Izuku got up looking a little unsure. "Are you sure this is a good idea, Toga or Himiko-san?" The pout she was about to give him washed away, and she nodded. "Don't worry, Izuku, I'm pretty good." With that she went at him. Izuku sent shadow tendrils at her, but to his shock she deftly avoided them with an unnatural swiftness that has to be her quirk. Now that got the gears in his mind turning at an increased rate. "What is her quirk?" "You're distracted," she said suddenly before him. "Ah." He raised a shadow shield only to be slapped across the face, hard. Izuku stumbled, but it provided enough of a distraction for Himiko to throw him to the ground and twist his arm behind his back. Himiko took a moment to look at their position, idly musing about her hasty decision to discard her box cutter, but shook her head. "I bet right about now you think I'm using my quirk right?" Izuku's curiosity was piqued. Are you?" She hummed and thought before close to his ears and whispering, "Beat me and find out." Himiko could feel him getting warm, and it took a moment to realize that it wasn't just because of her actions. A golden light alerted her, and she attempted a retreat to little effect as she was blasted off of him. Himiko felt a stinging sensation over her torso, but aside from that she was all right. Not for long, though, as Izuku started lobbing grenades at her. The first one she manages to dodge. However, it was a flash grenade that temporarily blinded her. With her sight gone, she was left open for another one that blew her back near a pile of junk. Better, she thought, rubbing out her eyes only to hear something land beside her. Himiko rolled a second before the grenade went off, creating a small sand screen in which she used as cover to escape. The moment she was out of sight, Izuku switched to dark control and looked around. The beach was empty. "Where is she?" He looked again. There were footprints in the sand leading to a tall junk pile, where he headed towards warily. "Come into my parlor," said the spider to the fly. Her voice eerily said. Izuku paused. This has trap written all over it, he thought, looking around, trying to find a trace of her from his spot. What would All Might do? Eventually, he mustered up the courage to pursue her. After a few minutes, he found that Himiko was really good at hiding. There were no footprints, no shuffling sands. It's like she vanished. It's not like the junk pile was big, yet he has been trying to find her for a while now, always on guard. He paused to think about everything he knew from the short confrontation with Himiko. She was fast, able to dodge close attacks unnaturally. Could it be her quirk was short-range teleportation? It made sense, yet Izuku wasn't about to bank everything on that before hearing it straight from her mouth. "Boo! Ah!" Izuku jumped back, clutching his heart, while Himiko laughed her head off. It took a moment, a really long moment, for Izuku to figure out what just happened. And when he did, his face turned crimson with indignation, and tears actually brimmed at his eyes. That wasn't funny, Himiko?" Suddenly she froze and eyed him. "What did you just say?" Izuku flinched at that, and took an involuntary step back as she walked briskly in his personal space to stare into his eyes. Now very uncomfortable with her invasion of his space, and feeling self-conscious, he swallowed but replied, I said it wasn't funny, Tog." "Himiko," she interrupted fiercely with a wide smile. "You called me Himiko." She was actually bouncing at this point. Taking a step back from the suddenly cheerful girl, Izuku had a thoughtful expression on his face. I guess I did. This is cause for a celebration." And before he knew it, she dragged him off again. I never expected my day to end up like this. Sitting next to Himiko Toga on the beach of a dilapidated seaside park, while watching the sunset and eating crepes. It was so surreal to Izuku. For a moment, he had to pinch himself to make sure he wasn't dreaming. And even then he took subtle glances at Himiko cheerfully eating her crepe to make sure he wasn't hallucinating. "It's no good?" Izuku blinked. Is it no good?" He looked to the pastry and shook his head. "No, I was just thinking." He then took a bite while mumbling to save himself from speaking anymore. Himiko scoffed. "I'll say." They ate in silence for a while, and at the end, before they walked their separate ways, Izuku made a decision. I just wanted to say thank you for this, Himiko-san." He flashed her a grateful smile that lit up his features. For her part, Himiko stared at him in stunned silence before her perma flush grew, and she grinned at him. "Hey, what are friends for?" Izuku smiled, just a little wider at her. "See you tomorrow." With that, he ran off. See ya, Izuku. Unlike him, though, she took slow, steady strides, a smile on her face the entire time, for she too had made a decision regarding her precarious relationship with Izuku. Sighing contentedly, she continued on her way, while humming a cheerful tune. His eyes fluttered open, and the first thing he noticed was the smell. His nose wrinkled in disgust. He tried to move, but was met with resistance, prompting him to see what was wrong. Both his arms and legs were bound to the chair. What the fuck, he mumbled, throat hoarse. He tried to force his hands and legs, but only managed to rattle the chains cutting into his skin. Oh, you're finally awake. He paused. His darted to where the sound was coming from. Who's there? He was met with silence, and sweat began to form on his brow. You know who you're dealing with, asshole. I'll fucking kill you. Asterisk thunk asterisk. He stared down at the butcher's knife that was suddenly brought down on his pinky and screamed. Oh, you shouldn't scream so loudly, 𝗵𝗲. It's only a finger. The figure walked around to face him. Why you? He said, the fear now palpable. The figure smiled. Let's get you nice and bloody. And brought down the knife again. A shabby-looking apartment complex with some bars on the windows, walls smeared with some graffiti, stood on an equally shabby-looking street filled with garbage. Men of questionable intent stood on the corner with their features obscured by hoods or hats. The alleyways were filled with garbage, graffiti smeared some of the walls, and there was a noticeable gloom about the place. Despite all this, Himiko Toga was in a good mood. She didn't know exactly when it started happening, or even why it did, but she could honestly say she was in as good a mood as she had ever been in a long, long time. The cause of this, as it is with most young preteen girls, it had to do with a boy. A timid, strong-willed, weak, strong, nerdy, and adorable boy by the name of Izuku Midoriya. Could this be what love feels like? Her cheeks burned at the thought, and she could feel the temperature through her palms. It made her giddy with anticipation to see him today. So much so that she was tempted to sneak inside the school and give him a surprise visit. She shook her head at that. No, none of that. Izuku isn't that type of boy. He wasn't like her old boyfriends, and he definitely wasn't like him. Yet at the same time, she found herself drawn to him, even though not much blood has been spilt. Now she's convinced it has to be love. With that thought in mind, she happily skipped along. Why do I suddenly have a bad feeling? His eyes shifted to the clock. Oh, it's about that time. About that time for him to go about his training and with Himiko. He gulped at that. There was no doubt Himiko Toga has been a great help this past year, and even though she has her quirks, not that he'd figured out her actual quirk, he could tentatively say that she was a friend. A very bubbly and oddly cute friend whom has wormed her way into that position through sheer persistence. And the fact that he still hasn't gotten over his slight stuttering problem with her. Which brings him to his latest dilemma with his sort of friend. Lately, it feels like the dynamic in their relationship has changed, and for the life of him, he couldn't figure out when, how, or why. He no doubt realized he's all but dropped his guard around her, and it's thanks to in part by Himiko herself. Somehow, sometime during their year-long reluctant acquaintanceship on his part turned friendship, she changed. And by the gods, he can't pinpoint when she did, how she did it, and for what reason. Izuku shouldn't have really thought of it as much as he did, but damn did it get to him. Someone who has been analyzing those around him for so long, yet missed a change in someone who has been arguably the closest to him since his mother. What the heck has he been looking at all this time? Why am I thinking about this anyway? He asked himself. Then he realized why. Yesterday, by pure coincidence, his mother met them while they were walking together from the halfway mark store. Needless to say, the ensuing conversation was the most embarrassingly awkward and fearful he'd ever had with his mother. Now she at least expects Himiko to be his girlfriend at some point, if she doesn't already think that. Izuku was half afraid that his mother would get the same vibe he did when he first met her, or she'd showed one of her odd quirks. To his surprise, nothing of the sort happened, and that's when he truly noticed the change. It would have been all good for the conversation to have been left off at that point, but his mother was so impressed by her that she invited her to dinner. And that's why he's been thinking of his girlfriend who happens to be a girl. Oh, now she's got me thinking about it. He never pegged his mother for the teasing type, but she shattered that preconception when she milked it with the insinuation when he went home. It was even more surprising, because he'd never actually thought of Himiko that way since she slashed his cheek with a box cutter. Yeah, he's not going to open that can of worms after the epiphany he just had. A month into his hand-to-hand combat training with Himiko, and Izuku found that despite his great power and strategic thinking, more times than not Himiko would beat him, sometimes literally. The first time she had him in a sleeper, another time she wrapped her legs around his neck and threatened to strangle him. That was an experience. Of course, she never actually pulled through, but the fact remains that he was still caught unawares, and if it were a villain then 9 times out of 10 he would be dead. It also didn't help that Himiko was horribly blunt in the ways she could have ended him, and not to mention graphic details that raised a lot of questions he was frankly too scared to ask for some time. When he eventually did ask how she knew all this, she said her family hired an ex-veteran soldier to teach her self-defense. Apparently the man was dedicated to his job. She also mentioned that he might have been off his medication, and that he held some very interesting insights into the art of lethal. Izuku decided not to pry into her life any further. Either way, he decided that a change in regiment was required, as he'll need to have combat training down to not be helpless in a close-range battle. As his frequent spars with Himiko showed, his powers only work for mid to long-range fights. He knew he'd have to change that soon, and changed it he did. Some days Himiko regretted opening Izuku's eyes to his inadequacies in combat situations. Nowadays she saw less of his presence, as he devoted the time they would spend at the seaside park, now almost devoid of all garbage, to learn martial arts. Something she would have been happy to teach, if she actually knew how to teach properly. Luckily today was not to be one of those days, as she had a surprise in store for him. She smiled as the door opened. Himiko-san. Hello, Mrs. Midoriya. Her smile was so brittle that the younger girl could see it from a mile away. I'm sorry, is this a bad time? Well, no, I just wasn't expecting you. It's all right, Mrs. Midoriya. A new voice spoke up, and she made way for a tall man in a coat. I already said what I came to say. Thank you, Detective. Himiko maintained her expression, as the detective gave her a nod, which she returned, and headed to the parked car she saw across the street. Himiko-san, that got her attention. Please come in, the young girl obliged. I'm sorry about that. I wasn't expecting company so soon, the woman frantically spoke. Would you like some tea? Yes, thank you, she said politely. As Inko scrambled for the kitchen, Himiko took the chance to look around the home. It was average size, if not a bit small, but enough to hold mother and son. She'd seen this place before, but always from afar, and now that she was in it, she couldn't help but feel at home. Her gaze then swept to the woman of the house. Despite being of age, she had a pretty face with a slim figure, and straight long dark green hair, no doubt where Izuku got it tied into a small ponytail with the rest just reaching above her shoulder. From the way how she was operating right now, Himiko could also tell where Izuku got his worrywart nature from. Himiko took a sip of tea. It's delicious, thank you, Mrs. Midoriya, she said honestly. The woman managed to smile at the compliment. You are welcome. Her eyes then drifted to the clock. It wouldn't have seemed like much, except that was the 12th time in 6 minutes she did that, and so Himiko was compelled to ask, did I come at a bad time? No, heavens no, it's just that, she trailed off. Did it have something to do with that man? She guessed at this. Inko sighed, and placed the tea down. No, rather it was what he had to say. She looked to the clock again. What did he say? Inko drummed her fingers against the teacup she held for a moment before speaking. A few months ago Izuku was jogging home late one night, when he witnessed a girl being assaulted. That's all for today, Izuku, spoke an elderly man with short gray hair and a thick gray mustache, wearing a black shirt with gray pants. Izuku, clad in a training gi, stopped his kata and bowed towards the man. Thank you, Shishu, he bowed. I will be seeing you again tomorrow. Yes. The elderly man chuckled, his mustache quivering at the gesture. Izuku meanwhile went to change out of his gi. Afterwards he said farewell to the deceptively frail-looking elderly man, whom he no doubt knew is a master martial artist of the highest caliber. How was he so sure of this? Because Izuku knew that in his prime, the man used to be a hero, and not just any hero, but the hero formerly known as Silver Fang. At a time where quirks were still relatively new to the world, he, along with a handful of individuals, were the first to be given the title of heroes in Japan. At the time, tensions were high between normal people and the super-powered community, with a rise in crime and early villains making a power grab using their quirks. Some of them were even bold enough to try taking over countries via a coup. The truth is, Izuku, along with everyone who ever called themselves heroes, or hell, most average quirk users owe him a debt of gratitude. He was one of the founding members of the Hero Association, along with others such as Atomic Samurai, Tornado of Terror, and Blast. All of them have now faded into obscurity with the rise of so many other quirk users. Izuku didn't like that. Those individuals of the first Hero Association did more than just stop villains. They gave the public, super-powered or not, hope and helped stop the discrimination against the then few quirked individuals. What they stood for, what they fought for, created the foundation for what modern heroes have built on over the decades. For them to just fade into the annals of history like this was a crime in and of itself. Though it's water under the bridge now, he still chastised himself for not recognizing a literal living legend when he walked through the doors of the dusty dojo. Though once he did, he promptly fainted, and when recovered asked for a lot of things, including, but not limited to, his autograph, acceptance into his dojo, and a whole lot more. Back then, the few heroes deliberately chose not to wear masks, wearing only sturdy outfits when they fought crime. It was as a way to not only gain the people's trust, but to also distance themselves from vigilantes who took the law into their own hands, often with violent results. And it worked. By God, did it work. There is not a hero alive whom you can't gain information on because of it. Did it provide a risk to the individual's families? Yes, but there were safeguards put in place that, for the most part, keep a hero's next of kin safe from a deranged villain willing to use them. That is, if they aren't meant with resistance, as no one is without a quirk. To the matter at hand, he felt life dealt his Shishu teacher a bad hand. He is fully aware of the circumstances surrounding Silver Fang's retirement into obscurity, and he understood why he chose to not bring himself any attention. At the same time, Izuku couldn't bear to see the man like this, wasting away in a dilapidated dojo with not a single student to pass on his teachings to. Izuku did want to learn a bit of self-defense, to not be caught off guard by an enemy who excels in close-range combat, but he made the decision long ago to become Silver Fang's disciple. Become a master of Silver Fang's style that made him, at the time, one of the most formidable fighters in all of Japan, and a recognized hero known across the world at one point. Of course, Izuku knew that what he was trying to undertake was a nigh impossible feat. To divide his time between studying for school, training his quirk, and learning an entire branch of martial arts was simply put beyond him. He would have to give up something in order to gain it, and unfortunately, that would have to be his quirk training. I could always train my quirk in Yui, he said as he opened the door to his home. I'm home, he called out, taking off his shoes. It was about that time a thought came to Izuku. His mind was so busy thinking about his teacher that he didn't bother to think about what was missing from his now routine walk from the dojo. Welcome back, Izuku. How was your time at the dojo? Pause. That was not his mother. Robotically, his body turned so slowly, you could hear the squeaks until it was pointed to the kitchen, where his mouth dropped in conjunction with his eyes bulging. Inside the kitchen with his mother was Himiko Toga, wearing an apron. This is the type of change he was talking about, for Himiko didn't look like the girl he had met before. She was still wearing that black sailor uniform that is a traditional middle school uniform, but what really caught him off guard was her hair. It was straight, clean, shoulder length, and done in a short ponytail. What am I looking at here? He had to question his eyes. Surprise, the girl yelled. Why? I wanted to surprise you. Well, she certainly achieved that much. I'm going to go to my room, he squeaked before running up the stairs. Dinner will be ready in a few minutes, his mother yelled out. Izuku barely heard it as he slammed his room door, locking it for good measure, and began pacing, wondering why Himiko just suddenly decided to go to his house, how she even knew his address, why his mother let her in, and how long they were even together. There was a glass-shattering effect as he realized that his mother and Himiko Toga were together, alone and unsupervised for an undetermined period of time. And judging by how his mother teased him about her the last time, and how Himiko's personality is in the first place then. The following 2 minutes Izuku spent screaming into his pillow. Later that night, a man wearing a blue sneakers, black jeans and black hoodie, sunglasses and baseball cap, walked the streets enjoying the sights. All the while he kept mumbling under his breath when his eyes caught someone. She was a dainty thing in a mini dress and blue jean jacket, a decent rack, wide hips and thick hips. Her skin was smooth, creamy, and looked oh so juicy that his teeth grinded together. He had to have her. It took 3 hours for her date to be finished, 3 tedious hours of resisting the urge, 3 days of watching her flesh being spoilt with contact by her date. But in the end, it was all worth it when he finally caught her by herself while she was walking home. It was simple enough to catch her unawares and shove her into her apartment. What he wasn't prepared for was her quirk. A sonic scream ripped from her mouth and blasted him into the ceiling, where he landed in a crumpled heap on the ground. She has some fight in her. Good. He liked when they resisted. It made cutting them down more rewarding. She screamed again, but he leapt from his prone position in the air. Her scream was enough to deafen and disorient them at close and mid-range, but she wasn't as powerful as some heroes like, say, Present Mike. Now he was annoying. His teeth extended into spikes that pierced her leg, cutting her sonic scream into a regular one. The first thing he did after landing was to punch her in the throat, causing her choke and grab it. He stood over her and opened his mouth. Time to claim my prize. It was not the first time tonight that Izuku wondered if he could make a noose out his clothes and hang himself by jumping off the couch. And here is Izuku when he thought he might have a quirk like Deer and me, Inko said fondly as she and Himiko shared a picture album. That's so cute. Toga gushed. Death can't be this busy, he silently thought to himself, looking up to the heavens. As she turned the page to see an older triumphant Izuku with his palm glowing with light. I recognize this. And this is when he finally found out how to activate his quirk at will. It's getting kind of late, Himiko-san. Shouldn't you be going home? At this, both females' eyes went to the clock and saw that it was close to 9:30. Time sure flies, Himiko whistled as she got up and bowed to the matriarch. Thank you for your hospitality. The move shocked Izuku more than it did his mother, who simply waved her off. Think nothing of it. Well, I better get going. I'll walk you home, Izuku immediately spoke. Himiko gave him a puzzled look before noticing his mother and smiled, sure. As they walked down the street, Izuku jumped straight to the chase. Why did you come to my house today? I wanted to surprise you. Izuku frowned. Himiko-san. What? I am telling the truth. He raised an eyebrow. Really? Okay, fine, she relented. I wanted to talk to your mom. Why? She looked at him. To get to know you better, of course. He opened and closed his mouth. But why? He pressed in confusion. I mean, there is really not much to know about me. Yes, there is, she disputed rather forcefully. Like why you train every day. I already told you, for developing your quirk so you can be a proper hero, she droned. Yeah, I know, but why are you trying so hard? You never told me that. Why do you think you have to try so hard to become a hero? Why do you do it? What drives you every morning to get up and do drills, develop your quirk, and learn how to fight? She pressed, backing him into a wall where she used her arms to box him in. Aye, he swallowed nervously, now noticing the height difference between them. Toga didn't seem to care as she continued. You told me you want to go to Yuyui, but I'm pretty sure no one else is trying this hard to do it. Just what are you trying to prove, Izuku Midoriya? Izuku stared, his previous embarrassment forgotten. He stared at her, but he wasn't staring at her. Look, you made him cry. I won't let you hurt him anymore. You playing at Hero Deku? You don't even have a quirk. He looked down, Izuku. She couldn't see it, but his eyes clenched shut. Show yourself, Deku. Get out here so I can kill you. Lights out. His eye snapped open, and he drew in a ragged breath. Izuku? Huh. He looked up. Himiko was no longer close, but at some point backed up, and with good reason spikes of dark had coalesced around him and jutted outwards. I'm sorry, the darkness faded away. It's okay, she said a little guiltily. I shouldn't have pried. No, he paused and looked at his hands. It wasn't always like this, you know. My quirk, it didn't come to me as easily as it did everyone else. I never even realized I even had quirk. No one did so before I found out. Everyone called me quirkless or useless Deku, because I was always weak and couldn't do anything right. He chuckled bitterly. Actually, they still do. Himiko frowned. Izuku, Kaken was the one who gave me that name, he interrupted. I know him. Wasn't he your friend? Yeah, he was, he smiled sadly. We both wanted to be heroes like All Might. We were practically inseparable. Then he got his quirk. I didn't, and suddenly he was the center of attention. Getting praises and suddenly having a lot more friends. I never really cared much for his quirk. Not really. I admired him way before he ever got his quirk. You admire him? I still do. He chuckled derisively. He always strived to be the best. He never let anyone get in his way, and he had a lot of passion, especially towards his goal. I want to be just like All Might, but Kaken, he wanted to surpass All Might as a hero. I think I was the only one he knew besides Mom and his parents that saw him for more than his flashy quirk. He was just a boy to me, a friend, not some wonder boy. I knew that, he knew that, and because I didn't see him as this unbeatable, insurmountable thing, he started, I don't know, see me as a threat. He took a long pause as if he was thinking of his next words. Yeah, Izuku said, nodding as if confirming. I think. He didn't really know how to deal with someone who just thought of him as a normal person, so he did what he always did with things that bothered him. He lashed out in the worst ways. He bullied me, belittled me, called me names, anything to make me feel inferior to him, and he did it without seemingly any regard for my health. Bastard was the first thing that came to Himiko's mind. Obasan told me that they went through a rough patch. This is a lot more than just, I guess I shouldn't have expected any better, he continued. It's just like Kaken to respond physically to anything he thought of as a threat. I didn't get it back then, but I had a lot of time to think about it. Ever since I moved here. Mom told you about the fight we had that made us move here, right? Yeah, She said they had a little fight, and she thought it would be best to give them some space. Seeing that 𝐭 was a worrywart, Himiko didn't think much of her decision. But now, you see, at the time I was still developing my quirk, and it affected my brain chemistry. So I was down, sad, angry, agitated, and I didn't know why. Then Kakin being Kakin started to pick on me, and that made me feel even worse, so I threw the first punch. Himiko's eyebrows shot up. No doubt the bastard deserved it. But to think Izuku was the one to hit first was, well, if she was honest. The thought was very appealing. Then he retaliated with his quirk. So I found the storage shed, locked the door, and turned off the lights, so I could make it an even playing field. The only reason why Himiko wasn't grinning at the thought right now was how Izuku looked. He was ashamed, devastated, and sad at the same time. His sad green eyes, devoid of any of his usual cheer, made her stomach churn. I was telling the truth about why I dedicate every single day to bettering and understanding myself and my quirk, Himiko-san. Because the last time I didn't just lose my senses, my mother's peace of mind, and my home. I lost my friend, and I have nothing to show for it except this. He lifted his shirt to show her a large burn scar across his torso, and pulled it back down when her mouth dropped in a silent gasp. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have asked. He raised his hand, and she remained silent as he gave her a sad smile. It's all right. He looked around. Is this far enough? Yeah. I'll see you tomorrow, Himiko. You too, Izuku, was all she could say to retreating back. With her mood now thoroughly down, a dejected Himiko Toga walked the streets alone, and the day started so great too, she thought, then stopped. Izuku had his head down, mentally trying to calm his thoughts, but to no avail. But it was something to be expected, especially since he opened the floodgates of emotion he had cut off in pursuit of training. With that thought, it's going to be a while before he could find something to distract his mind from the emotional torment. Izuku. He turned, and was almost tackled off his feet, but luckily managed to plant his footing as his hands reflexively came up to hold whatever hit him still. And that something happens to be Himiko-san. His shout of surprise was muffled by something soft, and when she pulled back, Himiko had Cheshire-like grin on her face. At that point, Izuku was in a suspension of disbelief so badly that he didn't even realize what happened until she said the 10 words that would forever change his current life onwards. I like you, Izuku. Will you go out with me? As far as distractions for the heart go, this is about as good as he'll get. Meanwhile, show yourself, Deku. Get out here so I can kill you. He turned to see the boy next to the switch. Lights out. Gah, he snapped up. His breath came up in pants. Sweat dropped down his body, and red eyes darted around frantically for a moment before they settled down. Shit. He flopped back down on his bed as the memories of that day resurfaced. The thoughts only caused him to growl in a mixture of anger and annoyance. Damn you, fucking Deku. To be continued.